Hello, my name is Sol Soler. I'm a philosopher and a theoretical physicist. And this lecture or podcast, or whatever you prefer to call it, is titled Introduction to the Principles of the Physics of Consciousness as an Aid to Spiritual Enlightenment. Okay. So I'm a philosopher and a theoretical physicist, trained as a theoretical physicist, and I work on consciousness, and particularly I've constructed a new theory of consciousness that has a lot of profound implications for what it is to be a human being, a conscious human being. So, we're all human beings, which means that we are both physical entities, but we're also conscious entities. I say we're physico-conscious entities. So we're physical, we're made of energy and particles, but we're also conscious. And I've put together a scientific theory that a set of simple principles that we can use to understand the nature of our physico-conscious existence. And these principles and this understanding of consciousness, it's a new theory of consciousness, and it has profound implications for philosophical and existential implications for ourselves as physico-conscious entities. And I personally have found this theory a tremendous benefit in my spiritual understanding of myself and my universe and how I relate to my universe. So it's been of great benefit for me on my journey as, my enlightenment journey or my awakening journey. So to begin with, I suppose I should say that I consider awakening and enlightenment, I consider these things as processes. I think in the past, enlightenment and awakening tended to be viewed as events. Suddenly Buddha, sitting under the Bodhi tree, achieved enlightenment in one moment. And then after that event, from then on, for the rest of his life, he was an enlightened human. And now, that could very well be what happened to Buddha, but I think nowadays we tend to view awakening and enlightenment more as an ongoing process, and a human being doesn't achieve some sudden miraculous moment of enlightenment, but rather, if they put in the effort, the meditative and spiritual effort, they can become more and more enlightened as they journey through life. So that's more how I would consider enlightenment, an ongoing process that I think involves basically aligning yourself more and more with the truth about your existence, the truth about the realities of your existence. And the more aligned you are with the truth concerning your physico-conscious existence, the truth about your universe and how you relate to it, the more enlightened you are. But I think this can go on indefinitely. I think humans are very far away from a total and complete understanding of the universe, but we're gaining more and more understanding. And as we do gain more understanding, we become more and more enlightened. And these principles of the physics of consciousness that I've constructed and the whole theory that I've constructed, I think it can be a great aid in this process of spiritual awakening in terms of aligning yourself with the truth about your sorry, very loud motorbike going by. The truth about your physico-conscious reality, the truth about your the physico-conscious universe that you exist in, and how you relate to that universe. The more we understand these things, I think the more enlightened we become. Okay, So about myself. So let me explain how these principles have affected myself and my journey. Well, I'm a scientist. I wasn't raised as a scientist. My parents didn't raise me as a scientist, but I was born and raised in the West, and I received, very loud vehicles here. I received a scientific education. So from very early on, I was taught to view the world scientifically. In primary school, we were taught about the scientific method, and we did little experiments, and my father has a very scientific mind, very logical scientific mind, very matter of fact. He liked to explain how the world worked to me in terms of cause and effect and mechanisms and things like that. He'd explain to me how the engine in his car would work, and I was very interested in these things as well as a young child. And then, in school, studied science. When we started to be able to choose our subjects in school, I chose physics and maths and applied maths. And then I went to university and studied theoretical physics, which was a huge amount of just making mathematical models of our universe. My understanding of the universe, of our universe, our existence, was through the lens of modern science. That was exclusively how I understood the universe, really. I was also brought to church as a Catholic, but early on my dad made it obvious that he didn't believe in God and that type of thing. And he was my, intellectual role model. So as soon as I noticed he didn't believe in any of that, he was still happy for me to go to church, and he liked Jesus's teachings a lot. But he didn't really believe in these things, and he was teaching me how to view the world logically and scientifically, and I quickly dismissed all that without even realizing that I had dismissed it. And you know how church is. Church is not, children. It's not aimed at children. It doesn't help a child's understanding at all, because the languages, at least the churches I went to, we were reading language. The Bibles, the translations were in language, Old English, that I couldn't understand. And it just had no appeal to children the way spirituality was taught in the churches I went to. So, was I an atheist? I don't think I was exactly an atheist. The way I like to put it is I was a 99% atheist. So if you'd asked me if do I believe in God, I would have said it's possible, I suppose. I think I do remember always thinking it was possible, but it seemed extremely unlikely because of the way I'd been brought up so scientifically, the materialistic view of the universe. And then there was the question of religion. Most religions didn't make sense to me whatsoever. It seemed very archaic, and didn't make a lot of sense to me from my modern scientific perspective at all. So I basically didn't pay any attention to religion or spirituality for the first half of my life. I was focused on philosophy and science, and understanding the universe based on our physical scientific theories of the universe. Okay, I didn't insist that there was no God or anything like that, but I could see no evidence for God, and a lot of what was claimed by certain religions I was exposed to seemed like nonsense, which it does to a lot of people who've been brought up scientifically. But my hero has always been Socrates, and Socrates says, or said, wisest is he who knows least. So Socrates being my hero, and that particular maxim meant that I was never willing to say for certain there's no God, or that there's no spiritual aspect to our existence. But I could see no evidence for it. I could see no evidence for souls. It seemed like our bodies were just made out of particles and energy, and when we die, that's the end of our existence. That's what that seemed to be the case, and that seemed to, I was very troubled by the fact that life seemed to, end totally and eternally. That troubled me philosophically and existentially a lot. Like, I was scared of that eternal non-existence, which I think is scary. I think you're a very unusual person if, like, let's say if you're an atheist. I think more and more atheists are willing to accept that the prospect of eternal non-existence is not a great prospect. So yeah, I found that, disturbing. Basically, it scared me. Anyway, but I viewed the world scientifically, and that didn't seem to, I couldn't reconcile that with what I knew about religion, which was very little at the time, because I was forced to go to church, and it didn't speak to me. The Catholic churches I was going to. Okay, but yeah, I kept studying physics and philosophy, quite obsessed with philosophy, and which is why I studied physics. Actually, in school I was obsessed with philosophy, but then my interest in philosophy led me to physics. I didn't want to study philosophy in university at all, because I'd read Plato and things like that, and I didn't want to go and study Plato for which is what first year philosophy courses is, a whole lot of Plato, and I didn't want to go and do that. And I was much more interested in quantum mechanics and relativity. I thought they were much more philosophically interesting, so that's why I chose physics. Okay, so that's a little bit about myself, and then working on physics and consciousness. Maybe how old was I? When I was approximately 30, I had a great idea, an insight that I have developed into a scientific theory of consciousness. And I've written the principles of the physics of consciousness, which are some simple, well-defined scientific principles that can be used to analyze any conscious system and to make theoretical models of conscious systems. So it works by analogy with Newtonian mechanics, where Isaac Newton stated his well-defined principles of motion, and his laws of motion and his law of gravity. And once you got these things well defined, they could be applied to any macroscopic physical system. They have, general applicability, which is what you need in a scientific theory. It needs to be your theory of consciousness, or your theory of motion. It needs to be applicable to any and every system. That's how you know you've got a good theory on your hands. So I had this insight, and then started developing my principles of the physics of consciousness. And developing these principles, for me, was also a spiritual awakening. The two things happened concurrently. As my understanding of consciousness expanded, it made spirituality more and more plausible to me, and I became a more and more spiritual and more awake or more enlightened person. That's still ongoing, because I spent 30 years as basically an atheist and a nihilist. So that's 30 years of me thinking in very particular ways. And as we know from neuroscience, any thinking you do causes changes in the configuration of your brain. So I was thinking in certain ways the whole time, and that molds your brain into a particular way of thinking, literally, in terms of the physical stuff of your brain, the neurons of your brain. So my brain was very solidified into a nihilist in the sense that I thought, oh, I get these, 70 years if I'm lucky. 70, 75 years to live, and then it's eternal non-existence. And I was like, for me personally, now it's different for different people, but for me personally, I think if our lives end and then we stop existing for eternity, for infinity years, that made life meaningless for me personally. I still loved people, had relationships, cared so much, but then I'd think, oh my God, my mom will die or I will die, and I'll never see my mom for an infinity of years. I'll never have any interaction with her or any of my loved ones ever again. And more fundamentally than that, I'll never exist again. I'll never just be. I'll never have any existence. Once you're alive, you get very used to existing. And yeah, the thought of not existing for eternity robbed life of all meaning for me. And I think that's pretty inescapable. I think that's pretty general. But anyway, people have different reactions to these types of things. But the thing about me is I wasn't able to look away from it. Some people seem to believe that they'll die and stop existing for eternity, and they seem to be able to just get on with their life. I wasn't able to just get on with my life like that. And I guess this is how kind of a good definition of a philosopher, the fact that philosophically I understood the universe to be like that at the time affected my life very profoundly. So I was very nihilistic in the sense that I was very reckless with my own life, and I saw no larger overarching meaning. Whatever happened was, there was no difference in terms of situation A happening or situation B happening, because ultimately the whole universe was just going to be dead and gone. So it didn't matter if I achieved something or didn't achieve something. I don't know, if I failed in some way or other, I would just think to myself, well, it doesn't make any difference really. I'm going to be gone for eternity, and the universe is going to be gone for eternity after a while, and all of this will be of absolutely no consequence. And yeah, so I thought in that particular way for a very long time. I mean, for decades, until I had my awakening experience, which for me to have a spiritual awakening, it had to be scientific. I just from such an early age, I viewed the universe scientifically. And that's just how and I believe in science. I think the whole modern world believes in science. Science is how you're listening to me now. It's how the internet works. The satellites in the sky. I don't know exactly how the internet works, but I know that I could go to YouTube and type in, how does the internet work? And I know that scientists will be able to explain in great detail how the internet works. And then I could go and get a job in a internet Wi-Fi, internet service provider, and I could see the ins and outs of it. So I think we all do believe in science. So if we are going to be spiritual, if we are going to be awakened beings, it has to be a scientific awakening. It has to, spirituality and science have to reconcile, or else spirituality has to disappear. Because science is definitely not going to disappear. Unless we have World War III or some sort of disaster that sets us back thousands of years. If we avoid such things, then we're not going to become an unscientific species, because we rely on science too much, we enjoy science too much, and it works too much. It's how the planes stay in the sky, how the satellites stay in space, it's how you're hearing me now, it's how the internet works. Science is explaining the genome, genetics, and things like that. If we get sick, we all go to scientific doctors in the hope of getting better. So we're definitely a scientific species. Definitely a scientific species. So for us to be a spiritual species, our spirituality will have to be scientific, which I think is absolutely possible. And I hope to show you in these lectures how to make our spirituality more scientific, more strictly scientific, or reconcile it with modern physics. Okay, so yeah, I was more or less an atheist, and I was, very reckless because I saw no point to life. And then, had a particular moment of insight that led me to construct my theory of consciousness, my principles of consciousness, and that was a spiritual awakening. Now, so because awakening, we've got to realize, is a conscious process. Every development you make in your awakening journey is a conscious experience. So awakening and consciousness are intimately related things. Indeed, another way of describing awakening would be to say increased consciousness, an increased conscious understanding of your physico-conscious reality. So awakening and consciousness are intimately linked, and any increase in our understanding of consciousness increases our understanding of ourselves, because we're fundamentally conscious beings. And that's why I think the study of these principles of the physics of consciousness can be a great aid to anyone on a journey of spiritual awakening. Especially, so in particular, these lectures, I think, might be especially helpful for people who have been educated scientifically, which is a lot of the Western world, and most of Asia as well. Most of the world is educated scientifically now, and that's how we view our universe. And so I think these lectures could be particularly helpful if you've been educated scientifically, but then you've also experienced some spiritual calling as well. Because I think that there's a kind of conventional way of interpreting our modern physics philosophically. So there's science, and then there's philosophy. There's our physics, and then there's our philosophical reaction to our physics. And I think, at least when I was growing up, so over the last few decades, the philosophical reaction to modern science has been: there is no God, there are no souls, and when you die, you're dead and you're finished forever. I think that was, not every scientist said that, but that, in my experience, being educated as a scientist, that was the general consensus opinion. And you even have Stephen Hawking pronouncing and declaring with 100% certitude that there's definitely no God, and he was kind of the pope of the scientific establishment. I know obviously there's no pope, but he was kind of if there was a pope, it would have been Stephen Hawking. And now he's dead, so now it would be Richard Dawkins, who is also a very militant atheist and denies that there's any such thing as souls, any such thing as God, any such thing as a higher purpose or higher meaning to our lives that transcends death. So what I mean to say is there's an antagonism between science and spirituality, where a lot of people who have gone the scientific route in life, if you are very quick to say that any talk of spirituality whatsoever is just garbage, nonsense, rubbish, woo woo, and that is because of their philosophical reaction to modern science. Because Isaac Newton made the world deterministic. He showed that the world is, his picture of the universe was a picture where the universe is deterministic. So in Isaac Newton's universe, you have basic matter, and that basic matter is unconscious. It's devoid of consciousness, like rocks and particles and things like that have no consciousness within themselves whatsoever, and they just act according to cause and effect, and it's totally deterministic. A happens, which causes B to happen, which causes C to happen, and so on. And the universe is just this giant, cold, dead clockwork, like a Rube Goldberg machine. And yeah, there's no room in that picture for free will, or for the human soul, or for any sort of, meaningful spirituality. So spirituality had to kind of ignore science. They weren't reconcilable with that philosophical reaction, or that philosophical picture of the universe. But that, of course, was Newtonian mechanics. That's before quantum mechanics, which is extremely significant, and relativity, but quantum mechanics is more significant when it comes to consciousness. And that changes everything. And until now, quantum mechanics and consciousness has been a mystery. So, and since, and you probably know that scientifically, if you have studied science, if you are interested in science, you'll know that consciousness currently is considered a scientific mystery. There is no accepted theory of consciousness. There are lots of theories, but there's no theory that's considered to be correct. And there's no understanding of consciousness. If you read New Scientist magazine, for example, you'll see headline after headline saying the mystery of consciousness. Consciousness is always called a mystery, and quantum mechanics as well is considered a mystery. As in, there's no... The experiments are have been very extensively carried out, and they're very accurate experiments. They're the most accurate experiments ever carried out in terms of how precisely we can measure and predict the outcomes of experiments. But no one understands what quantum mechanics really means in terms of the fundamental nature of the most basic particles and energy of our universe. So yeah. The Newtonian view of the universe, this deterministic dead clockwork, is just not valid anymore. It was valid for a time. And what do we mean by valid? When we say valid, we just mean that Newton's theory worked. The reason we believe in any particular theory is because it works. And Newton's principles could be used for any dynamical system involving macroscopic objects. And macroscopic objects are deterministic, as in you can predict what a macroscopic system will do. But Newton's theory has some glaring holes in it, and one of the biggest holes is consciousness. Newton's theory, nowhere does it mention consciousness, and it can't be used to make predictions about the conscious behavior. And it also can't be used for microscopic behavior. That's where quantum mechanics comes in. Quantum mechanics is examining individual particles and molecules and photons and things like that, looking at their behavior, and there Newton's theory totally breaks down and it doesn't work anymore. And what I am proposing to you now is that the mystery of consciousness and the mystery of quantum mechanics, these are twin mysteries. They're related to one another. And solving one solves the other. If you solve quantum mechanics, you solve the mystery of consciousness. Now, obviously, then you've got to construct a theory, and the theory will keep on expanding. But in terms of the basic principles, you solve one and you solve the other. As in, the solution to make sense of quantum mechanics involves making sense of consciousness, and consciousness is involved fundamentally in the correct understanding of quantum mechanics. Okay, so that's okay, so that's this is an introduction to the principles of the physics of consciousness and how they might help you in your awakening journey. Because if you have been educated in science, you might find that your science holds you back, or I found anyway, that science held me back from any sort of spiritual investigation, because I was so indoctrinated into science and the scientific view of the world that, when people talked about spirituality, I didn't read Bibles and I didn't read very spiritual texts. I just read science and philosophy, and I just didn't examine those things. So I was just very ignorant of those things because I'd already dismissed it all, because I thought science had basically proven that there was no spiritual aspect to life. I thought we were just these determined material, mechanisms that somehow consciousness had switched on in. So we had some conscious awareness within ourselves, and then we could just, mess around on the earth for a few decades, then die and be eternally gone. So yeah, I found my scientific education held me back from spirituality. But what I want to present to you, or to anyone who's interested in both a scientific understanding of the world and a spiritual understanding of our existence, are these principles of consciousness, how they work, how they apply to our universe, their philosophical implications, and basically use them to paint a new picture of our universe and how we relate to it as physico-conscious beings. And when I say a new picture, it's by no means a totally new picture at all. In fact, it's almost equivalent to the picture of the universe painted in the Hindu Bible called the Bhagavad Gita, which I'm sure a lot of people on this forum have read. So in the Bhagavad Gita, there are a lot, in terms of the large-scale structure of my theory, it's equivalent to the large-scale structure of the theory presented in the Bhagavad Gita. But where the ancient Hindus based their theory on macroscopic evidence, I've based my theory on microscopic evidence. So my theory is primarily based on a new understanding of quantum mechanics, whereas their theory is based on macroscopic evidence, such as they noticed that they were conscious, and they noticed that they would eat food, and that food was ultimately turned into themselves, which was conscious, and from that piece of evidence, amongst many other pieces of evidence, and based on a lot of meditation as well, they discovered that everything, all the physical energy of our universe, is intrinsically conscious, which is the fundamental postulate of my theory as well. But my theory, I prove that my strongest piece of evidence in my theory for that fact is a new interpretation of all the experiments of quantum mechanics. Okay. So, yeah, what I can promise that this theory is strictly scientific, and I think it's really important to emphasize that. And for us to treat it very strictly and be very strict in our assessment of the theory and development of the theory. Because quantum mechanics has been hijacked a lot by spirituality and pseudoscience and things like that, and that doesn't do it any favors at all. So it's really important that we make sure and scrutinize the theory scientifically. As I mentioned, I went to university and I studied theoretical physics, and all we did was construct mathematical models of physical systems. It was a very rigorous course. And so I learned the scientific method inside out. So that's one thing I'm very confident in. This theory is definitely scientific. It's based on simple, well-defined scientific postulates. It will require, this is the first time you've heard the theory. So it will require actually some study, as in, it will require less study than learning Newton's principles, Newton's laws of motion, and how to apply them. But it will require some study, the same way learning Newton's principles requires some study and some careful reflection. But the thing is, it will make all of your spirituality much, much more plausible to you. Like if you've been brought up scientifically, you might find within yourself that there's some, conflict between your scientific understanding of the world and your spiritual understanding of the world. Now, given that this theory is totally rigorously scientific, it can help you reconcile that conflict and have much, much more faith in things like the existence of the soul, the existence of God. And when I say God, I don't mean a man in the clouds, not at all. I mean an overarching mind of the universe. But these principles actually allow for the construction of the first rigorously scientific theoretical models of things like the mind of the universe and the human physical soul, and also for models of reincarnation and statistical mathematical models of karma, which is very interesting. Karma actually works statistically. It's not exact, but because there are such large numbers of humans, if you've studied statistics at all, you know that things become very exact in statistics once you are dealing with very large numbers. Okay, so karma is actually statistical. Anyway, let me just check how much time I've been speaking. 36 minutes. So this is just a brief introduction to motivate you taking a look at the principles. All the principles are already up on the same channel as this video. If you're interested in both science and awakening, they are definitely worth some serious consideration. Because they are rigorously scientific, and it presents a picture of our universe that is both rigorously scientific but also spiritual and also conscious. Okay, these principles work by analogy with Newton's principles of motion. So before Isaac Newton, there were lots of theories about motion and about gravity. For example, you can read Aristotle's theory of gravity and why things fall to the earth. And it's a philosophical theory. And I mean, it's a proto-scientific theory of gravity, but we don't use it. And unless you're interested in philosophy, you've probably never heard it. And it's, it's basically useless. We can't use it. It can't be applied. What sets Newton's theory apart is that he had well-defined principles and a well-defined law of gravity. And these well-defined principles mean that you can isolate individual systems and you can use the principles to analyze the systems. And it was seen that the principles were generalizable, as in you could apply them generally. You could look at any system of macroscopic objects and apply his principles. And they, some systems were harder to analyze than others, but over the course of 300 years, we, humans, physicists, analyzed pretty much every conceivable macroscopic physical system using his principles. So this generality is really important in theories like this. And this is what sets my theory apart from all other theories of consciousness, is that it has well-defined principles, simple, well-defined principles. And you can go and listen to those principles whenever you like, and you can see how simple and well-defined they are, and how they're very similar to Newton's principles of motion, and how they can be used to make theoretical models of different conscious systems. So, for example, I can use my principles to make a theoretical model of human visual eyesight, for example, or human muscular movement. And in fact, all the experiments of quantum mechanics I interpret using consciousness, and every quantum mechanical experiment is actually a conscious system. Not just a two-slit experiment, but all quantum mechanical experiments can be analyzed using these principles, and each one is just a different conscious system. And yeah, now these sounds like big claims at the moment, but if you go and check the principles, you'll see they're remarkably simple, intuitive, logical, and easy to apply. You'll be able to start applying them yourself. They're so simple. Which is another indication of the validity of my theory, is that it's expandable and teachable, just like Newton's theory. Okay, so yeah, this is the introduction. So let me explain. I'm not going to go into the physics too much in this episode, because it's already all up on the same channel and you can go and check it out. Here is how I'd recommend the reading, how I'd recommend approaching the lectures, because there are a lot of lectures up there and they're not perfectly organized. I'm not very good at presentation, I'm not very good at technology or recording or things like that. So my production value is low, but I think you'll find that the quality of the philosophical ideas is high, I hope. So I would listen to this lecture. Then there's a lecture called Introduction, or no, it's called Day 1. Okay, Day 1. I would listen to that after this. That explains the basic change in postulate underlying my theory. So all physical theories are based on postulates. And my theory involves one particular very important change in postulate when dealing with consciousness. So, and in the lecture entitled Day 1, I explain that change in postulate. Okay, then after that, I would say to move on to the lecture entitled The Solution to the Hard Problem of Consciousness. I'll put all this in the description, this reading list, I suppose you might call it. So that's called The Solution to the Hard Problem of Consciousness. And in that lecture, that's quite an important lecture, I define and justify the principles of the physics of consciousness. So there you'll see the well-defined, simple, logical principles for analyzing conscious systems. Okay? After that, I would listen to the lecture entitled The Scientific Definition of Consciousness. If you want to put together a scientific theory of consciousness, you need a technical scientific definition of consciousness. So there's that lecture where I state the definition, justify it, and explain it. Then there's one interesting lecture called Fish and the Principles of Consciousness. That's one example of how we apply the physics of consciousness to different conscious systems. Particularly, someone asked me, how do your principles apply to the analysis of the conscious experience of a fish? So I explain how we can use my principles to analyze the conscious experience of a fish, which is quite interesting. That one's a bit more fun, let's say, if that's the right word to use. And yeah, I mean, this, we live in a very fast-paced world, I suppose. That's a very cliche thing to say, but it's true. So these things do take this is new physics, so it does take a little bit of careful reflection and study. Well, that's up to you. If you find them interesting, you'll be willing to put in that effort. But I just mean, yeah, well, and then there's another lecture called The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and the Solution to the Hard Problem of Consciousness. And that's a very important lecture. That's where I use the principles to give the correct interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics. So the experiments of quantum mechanics, quantum mechanics began a very, very long time ago with Max Planck in the early 1900s. Then Einstein did some quantum mechanics in 1905, and then quantum mechanics kind of exploded with Einstein and Werner Heisenberg and Niels Bohr and Schrödinger and Max Planck. They're kind of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics, and they did the experiments, and they also tried to interpret the experiments, but they never came up with an interpretation that they were satisfied with. Okay? They never could quite make satisfactory sense of it. Einstein in particular, the interpretation they came up with is called the Copenhagen interpretation, and that was written by Niels Bohr, primarily constructed by Niels Bohr. And Einstein hated Niels Bohr didn't particularly like it either. Like, he didn't find it philosophically very satisfying, but he just thought, well, the world is the way it is, and we've got to just accept how it is. Einstein hated it. He said God does not play dice. And was always trying to disprove Niels Bohr's interpretation, but he couldn't. But yeah, it's always troubled physicists, this interpretation. And then since then, there've been, and particularly over the past 50 years, there've been a whole lot of new interpretations presented. But again, none has been found satisfactory. Okay, but in my lecture called The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness, that's what it's called, The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness, I think. I explain how you use my principles to interpret quantum mechanics, and I interpret 4 of the most famous experiments of quantum mechanics using my principles. And I explain how these principles can be used for all the experiments of quantum mechanics, where every single quantum mechanical experiment is an isolated conscious system, and then we apply my principles of the physics of consciousness to each of these systems, and this interpretation makes very simple, logical, and intuitive sense of the experiments of quantum mechanics. Like, when you hear this interpretation, you go, oh wow, obviously, yeah, I think. Because it's just very intuitive. Okay, so that's how I would recommend approaching the lectures. So follow that reading list. It will take a bit of study, but once you're familiar with the principles, once you've assimilated them, you need to now the good thing is there's no new maths. You don't have to learn any maths. You don't have to do any calculus. Like, the toughest thing about learning Newton's principles is that you have to know calculus. You have to be able to differentiate. But in my theory, it's even simpler than Newton's theory. Like all good physics, it's really simple, really remarkably elegant and simple. And you don't have to learn any new maths. You won't have to do any mathematics at all. The mathematics has already been done in conventional physics. So that's good. I think anyone who's interested in the subject, if once you've had a few science lessons and a few maths lessons, I'd say anyone, maybe 11, 12, 13 years of age, could learn these principles and learn how to apply them and learn how to understand the universe in their light. Okay, and yeah, so, and once you find, and the thing is, you don't have to be totally convinced by these principles. You don't have to be, but the thing is, it will make ideas like the mind of the universe and reincarnation and the human physical soul, it will make concepts and ideas like that much, much more plausible. So if you found that your scientific education has made things like that, that there's some conflict between your belief in those things and your scientific education, this can reconcile those things and lead to great increase in faith in the spiritual aspects of your life, which is a great relief. Like this, it's improved my life tremendously. It's given my life as much more meaning now, because I think there's an overarching purpose. I think there's an overarching intelligence to our existence. I think we're not here just by blind chance. I don't think we're just predetermined machines. And my theory also, one of the key principles of my theory is limited free will. So my theory shows that you do have free will. And beforehand, when I believed that the whole world was just totally predetermined, that meant no free will. And for me, that made life, my decisions and things like that, totally meaningless. Which is pretty inescapable. You know, if you're not actually making your choices, and they're all just predetermined like a physical process, a deterministic physical process, then your choices have no meaning because you're not actually making them. Whereas my theory, one of the key principles of my theory is intrinsic, irreducible free will. So that when you make a choice, like you make a choice to like, share, and subscribe, for example, that it is actually you within yourself making that choice, and that's just a fundamental intrinsic property of the physical energy of our universe. Because one of the key things in my theory is that all that exists is physical energy. So in that sense, now we can start seeing how it is actually genuinely scientific. Because according to science, if you go and study science, if you want to be strictly scientific, all that exists in our universe is physical energy in space-time. And the physical energy can transform into particles, like electrons, protons, and neutrons. But all those electrons, protons, and neutrons are made of energy. All that was created in the Big Bang was physical energy, nothing else. And then that physical energy has taken on many different forms. It became particles, and then particles combined into atoms and molecules, and then after billions of years into cells, and after billions of more years into humans and into your good self. But according to science, all that exists is physical energy. So then we need a theory of consciousness that posits the existence of only physical energy if we want it to be scientific. So you'll see a lot of theories about consciousness and human existence where it's like, the human brain is an antenna for consciousness and it picks up conscious frequencies and stuff like that. And these theories are fine. I mean, I don't think they're good personally, but they're not scientific. Because if they were scientific, you'd need to be able to, if the brain was an antenna for consciousness, you'd need to be able to measure the consciousness that it's picking up. And there's been absolutely no scientific evidence for such things. Okay, for example, that's just one example. Or people say consciousness comes from another dimension, that apart from our three space dimensions, consciousness is picked up from another dimension. Well, again, that's a fine theory, and everyone's entitled to believe exactly what they want, but it's not a scientific theory. Because in science, if you go and study physics, all that you'll find is that there's three space dimensions, one dimension of time, and then there's energy. And the energy exists in space, and its configuration changes with time. And that's it. There's just nothing else. All particles are made of energy. You're made of energy. The particles can be transformed back into energy, and then we use the equation E equals mc squared to see just how much energy is contained in each particle. But it all started out as energy in the Big Bang, and there's nothing else. So we need a theory of consciousness, and we need our understanding of spirituality to be reconciled with that fact that it's all just physical energy. You're made of nothing except physical energy. But you're also conscious. And that's been the big sticking point in modern science. That's why consciousness is considered a mystery. So now, in the last 10 minutes, I'll explain very briefly the most basic aspects of the theory, okay? So last 10 minutes, a brief introduction to the theory to motivate you going and taking a closer look and studying the principles in more detail. Because with these principles, as I said, at the moment on my channel, all I've done is put physics up. It's just the principles, an explanation and justification of the principles. And I'm going to add more models now, more theoretical models. Theoretical models prove my theory is correct. Because this is the first theory of consciousness with which you can construct physical models of conscious systems. Okay, and then once I've got the physics done, once I've got the basic physics done, then I'm going to show how we can use the principles to make theoretical models of the mind of the universe, which would be God. So yeah, in my scientific spirituality, God is not a man in the clouds, and I know no one thinks of God like that anymore, but sometimes that's how scientists tend to ridicule God and caricature God as this old angry man in the clouds. No. For me, God is the universe itself forms a mind, because in my theory, all energy is conscious. So the universe itself forms a mind with things like stars taking the place of neurons in that mind. So the mind of God is not infinite. The mind of God has the same magnitude as the physical universe, which isn't infinite, at least according to our measurements in modern science at the moment. But if a mind that big, a brain the size of the universe, would correspond to intelligence that, from the human perspective, is basically infinite. There'd be no, from a human perspective, there'd be no way of distinguishing between an intelligence that immense and an infinite intelligence. Okay, and that mind of the universe has guided its physical evolution, the physical evolution of the universe, to facilitate the evolution of creatures like ourselves. And I will use my principles to construct models of the human soul. That is the physical human soul. So I believe the human soul is made out of particles and the basic physical energy. I don't think it's any sort of special spiritual substance. I think it's just basic energy, a matter of our universe in a particular special construction, that is the human soul, which exists within our central nervous system. And I think, so anyway, I don't want to get into that now. These will be, and there are many different models that you can create. So for example, when Einstein came up with his general relativity, they were just the basic principles of general relativity. He wasn't the first person to even use his principles to construct a model. The first model was by Schwarzschild, and it was for a non-rotating black hole. That was the first model created. And then, that model is very simple. In fact, it's too simple. And then other physicists used the same principles of general relativity to construct more accurate, more detailed models. And so the same thing applies here. I've defined the principles, and then myself and other people will use those principles to construct models. And at first, the models are very simple. And that's largely because I'm not a neuroscientist, so I don't have a very detailed understanding I have some understanding, some knowledge, but not a very detailed understanding of the human brain and nervous system. So in collaboration with neuroscientists and things like that, the models will become more and more detailed and accurate. Also, models of reincarnation. Okay. So yeah, there are many, using these principles, there are many possible models of this human soul, for example. And yeah, what will happen in the future is that more and more that models get picked because they make more sense to us, they become more accurate, and they explain more of our experience. And they can be differentiated as well by experiment. So some models of the soul will allow for experiments to be devised to check to verify the model in question. Okay, so yeah, a quick explanation of the basics of the theory. So it's very much like the Copernican revolution. Okay, so before Copernicus, scientists, astronomers were trying to understand the motion of the planets across the sky. So they'd look out at night and they'd see the stars, and the stars don't move. They're called the fixed stars. If you go outside at night and look at a star, you won't have to move your head. But if you go out and look at Mars or look at Venus, sometimes Venus and Mars are visible to the naked eye. you'll see them, they move across the background of the fixed stars. They actually move. And that's why the ancient Greeks called them planets, because the word planet means to wander. So the planets seem to wander across the night sky. And the ancient Greek astronomers wanted to understand why this was happening, and they tried to construct theoretical models of the solar system that explained the observed motions of the planets. But here's the thing. All the scientists always assumed that the Earth was at the center. So anytime they tried to make a theoretical model of the planets, they would put the Earth at the center. And then they'd put Mars and Venus and Jupiter, and the Sun would have to move around the Earth at the center. Now, they did construct models based on this assumption. In science, assumptions are called postulates. A postulate is just a technical assumption used to build a theory, used as the basis of a theory. And then if the theory works, you know your assumption is good. And now their assumption was that the Earth was at the center. And then the theories that they made, the models that they made, were a nightmare. So there's the most famous was called the Telemach Theory, after Ptolemy, and that's spelt with a P, so it's PT. If you want to check it, and if you do check it, you'll see that it's a nightmare. The Earth is in the center, and the Sun and all the planets are performing really crazy motions around the Earth. Like, to make sense of the observed motions in the night sky, the planets have to revolve around the Earth, but not only that, they have to revolve in circles as they revolve. So they're going in a circle around the Earth, and then they're making smaller circles as they go. And then not only that, but they have to be doing even smaller circles when they make the smaller circle. And these are called epicycles. And you need lots of epicycles to make it work. Anyway, it's an absolute nightmare. It works, it does work in a sense. Like, you can map the motions, but it's mathematically you can use what's known as Fourier analysis to show that you can map the motions of the planets as accurately as you want. With the Earth in the center, it's just exceedingly complex. Then Copernicus came along, and he changed the postulate, and this is what's important. He changed the postulate. He said, no, the Earth isn't at the center. The Sun is at the center. Now, the people at the time didn't like this, because the scientific establishment at the time wasn't purely scientific, it was also theological. And they wanted the Earth to be at the center, because they thought God had put the Earth and humans at the center of the universe. And it threatened them, the idea that God hadn't put the Earth at the center. But Copernicus said, if we put the Earth at the center, then all the planets perform simple ellipses around the Sun, and the Earth is just another planet going around the Sun. And you all know that model. Everyone on Earth has seen that model, where you have the Sun in the center and all the planets go around in beautifully simple ellipses. So that change in postulate is very, very simple, but it's also very, very revolutionary. And it caused a lot of disturbance for the people at the time, because they like, oh God, we have to believe now, we have to reconceptualize our existence in the universe quite significantly. We have to go from the center of the universe to just a third rock from the Sun, and there are many other suns or stars. And so it took a while for people to come to terms with this. Okay, but you can look at his change in postulate and see that it's exceedingly simple, but it is also revolutionary. It takes Earth from the center and puts the Sun at the center, and Earth is just third rock from the Sun. Now, that's very analogous to my theory. I make one simple change in postulate. It's very simple, but it's very revolutionary. So let me just explain that change in postulate, and then if you've found any of this interesting at all, you can go and check out the principles for yourself. So what's my change in postulate? Well, let me explain how. I just explained Copernicus and the pre-Copernicans. The pre-Copernicans were all putting the Earth in the center, and then they couldn't make sense of the motions of the planets. Okay, so this analogy is very exact. So now who are the pre-Copernicans. The pre-Copernicans now are traditional, conventional scientists who are trying to make theories of consciousness. Okay, they're trying to make theories of consciousness. And all of their theories are based on the assumption, the postulate, that the energy that was created in the Big Bang was totally devoid of consciousness. That everyone knows the Big Bang Theory, all the energy came into existence, all the physical energy of our universe came into existence in the Big Bang, and it was all crammed into one infinitesimal or almost infinitesimal point. Now, then, as physicists, we describe that energy, we describe its evolution, and we describe its properties. Now, as scientists have done this over the past few hundred years, they have always assumed that the physical energy created in the Big Bang was devoid of consciousness, had no conscious experience within itself. Okay, so that's the pre-Copernican postulate. Energy intrinsically, the basic energy of our universe, has no consciousness. So then, yeah, I'm painting myself as Copernicus here, but it's just the analogy is too exact not to use. The analogy is so exact, it's just impossible not to draw attention to it. So my theory, and all scientific theories, if you've studied science, you'll know all scientific theories are based on postulates. So the current postulate is that of theories of consciousness is that the physical energy of our universe came into existence devoid of consciousness. Then it created particles out of itself. And of course it created particles out of itself because particles exist. And these particles are also non-conscious, don't have any conscious experience within themselves. This has been assumed. Now it's just an assumption. And it turns out it's actually incorrect. So then these modern scientists of consciousness have spent 100 years at least trying to come up with a theory. How do these non-conscious energy and particles come together in complex formations, such as humans or dogs or snakes or jellyfish or bacteria or what have you, such that conscious experience somehow discontinuously turns on? Or they don't say turns on, they use the word emerges. Okay? But in all of their theories, you have non-conscious energy and particles that then come together into some special configuration, and then there's consciousness there. And then, but they just cannot, and this is and you really can check this. Modern scientists of consciousness do accept that it's still a mystery. Like, they openly admit it's a mystery. You can watch Roger Penrose, who's a very great physicist, and he's worked for a long time on consciousness. You can watch him on Joe Rogan admit that it's a mystery. We just don't know how the consciousness comes about. He thinks that consciousness is going to be in things called microtubules, which are very small physical constructions within the brain. But the consciousness isn't going to be there. But anyway, that's called the hard problem of consciousness. How are we conscious if we are made of nothing except physical energy and particles? And if the physical energy and particles aren't conscious, how do they come together into these special configurations such that we are conscious? And obviously you're conscious. You're consciously hearing my words and either agreeing or disagreeing, reflecting on them. You're having conscious experience right now. Now, according to science, you're made of nothing except energy and particles. And within yourself, and you know what's within yourself, energy and particles, and within yourself you're conscious. Okay, so for 100 years they've been trying to solve this mystery. How are we conscious if all the energy and particles we're made of are not? And the thing is, just like the pre-Copernican people, they're never going to solve that question because they're working with the wrong assumption. So just like Copernicus put the sun in the center of the solar system, I'm changing the fundamental postulate of consciousness to all the physical energy created in the Big Bang was and remains intrinsically conscious. So you're made of physical energy and particles, and you're intrinsically conscious. Your conscious experience of my words is taking place within your physical form at this moment. and you have consciousness in your feet and in your toes, and it all seems to happen within your physical form. Now, in my theory, that's because all the energy in particles is all conscious intrinsically within itself. So that's the big change in postulate. So we have this new postulate, and it's a scientific postulate. Because I've been in debate about this theory for a long time now, because a lot of scientists are trying to suppress me because they are professionally invested in their theories of consciousness. So they don't, basically, for professional reasons, they don't want me to be correct. But this is a scientific postulate. Like these other theorists, they do think that consciousness has an energetic basis. They just think that the consciousness switches on around energy at some point. But neuroscience has shown beyond doubt that our conscious experience is grounded in the physical configuration of our brains and bodies. That is, every change in your conscious state corresponds to a change in the physical configuration, observable physical changes in physical configuration of your brain and body. Okay, so my new postulate is that all the energy is intrinsically conscious and always has been. So the Big Bang took place, and that was a physical event. Physical energy came into existence. And within that energy, the Big Bang state, that first ball of energy, that was also a conscious experience. Now, at the moment, we don't know what that conscious experience was. But the physics of consciousness will expand until we can shed some light on what that conscious experience may have been. But for example, we don't know what the conscious experience of a bacteria is like, but we do know back now that bacteria are conscious. The Big Bang came into existence. All the energy was conscious within itself, just like you are now. The energy went through, physically evolved into particles. All the particles are conscious. The particles bound together into new forms, such as atoms. Atoms are conscious. They're just very simple configuration. They're not now, when I say an atom is conscious, I don't mean like, hey, I'm an atom. My name's Steve, the atom. No, I don't mean like that at all. It's a much simpler configuration, so it has much simpler conscious experience. So it will feel forces. Like, for example, when you accelerate in a car, you feel the force of the acceleration pushing the chair into your back. When an electron is accelerated in a field, in a force field of some kind, in an electric field, let's say, it feels that force as well. It feels the acceleration, just like you feel the acceleration, which makes sense because you're made of nothing of these except these particles, and you feel acceleration. So it makes sense that individual particles also feel acceleration. But then complexity evolves. So the particles bond into atoms, then molecules, then cells, and after billions and billions of years, all the way up to the complexity of humans. And humans are such complex configurations of conscious energy and particles that they are capable of self-reflection because of our big brains. Our big brains allow us to have self-reflection and to contemplate our own existence, and that creates contemplation of our own existence is the origin of spirituality and religion. And so that's why we're here now, contemplating the nature of our existence, the nature of consciousness. Whereas a dog doesn't have that sort of intellectual capabilities. Its brain is just less complex, and it's just not capable of that, basically because it has no linguistic abilities. You need linguistic abilities to philosophize. So the dog is just living a more simple conscious life, but it's still conscious, has conscious visual experience. So in its stomach, it will feel consciously hungry when it's hungry. But it just, it can't ask itself what is the meaning of life and when will I achieve enlightenment and things like that, because it just isn't that complex yet. But through evolution, one day maybe dogs will achieve that level of complexity, who knows. Anyway, so that's the basic change in postulate. And do bear in mind, it's perfectly scientific. The modern conventional scientists do accept that, or a lot of them accept that consciousness exists and it's related to physical energy, the physical construction of our brains. I'm just saying that the consciousness never switches on. They're saying that consciousness switches on at some point of complexity, consciousness switches on. I'm saying that consciousness doesn't switch on, that it's coexisted with energy since the Big Bang, because it is energy. What I'm saying is that that physical energy is physical consciousness. All energy is always conscious, and this energy can take on different physical forms, physical configurations. And as we know in conventional physics, different physical configurations give rise to different physical properties. And all I'm saying is that different physical configurations experience within themselves different conscious states and different conscious experiences. So you're having your conscious experience right now, and that's because of the exact configuration of all the atoms and particles in your body and brain, and I'm having my different conscious experience because I have a different configuration of atoms and particles and energy. Okay, but then we're having a very similar conscious experience because we're both humans, because the conscious energy has been configured into very similar formations, in that we both have 2 eyes, I assume, a nose, ears, and things like that, which are very similar configurations, and so they give rise to similar conscious experiences, which is why humans can understand each other. But then something like an atom is such a different configuration that it's taken humans a long time to recognize them as conscious. But my theory shows that even something like an electron or a neutron or a proton is intrinsically conscious, and that in the experiments of quantum mechanics, what you're witnessing is an entity like an electron making conscious choices using their free will. But of course, very simple consciousness, no sort of sense of self, no sort of, oh, I'm Steve the electron. Okay, that's the basics of the theory. And yes, it is, I've been debating with these other scientists, and a lot of them dismiss the theory, but they are, and you can go and check this out on the particular forums I've been debating them, they are totally incapable of providing any logical or scientific objection. So when you compare my theory to all the other existing theories, you'll see that my theory has well-defined principles, allows for the construction of theoretical models of conscious systems, and it's the only theory that can do that. And it's the only theory that solves the hard problem of consciousness. Okay, and if you go and check other theories, they fundamentally do not answer the question, how does non-conscious energy, in some special configuration, how does the consciousness turn on? They just cannot answer that question. Why? Because that's not how our universe works. So yeah, that's the basics of the theory, briefly outlined. So it's very like the Copernican revolution. So hopefully that has intrigued you to some extent, that you're willing to go and check out the principles. So they're very simple. So in my lecture entitled The Solution to the Hard Problem of Consciousness, I state these principles and justify them and explain how they're used. And so I think if you're interested in science and you're also interested in spirituality and awakening, these principles give very profound insight into your reality as both a physical and a conscious entity. Okay, so thanks for listening. Check out the other lectures. Okay, all the best.